where the wild and the domestic rarely cross paths, a tiny orphan bobcat lay helpless beneath the trees, alone, vulnerable, and crying for a mother who would never return. When Sarah Miller, a veterinary technician, took him in, she knew his chances of survival were slim. But hope arrived in the most unexpected form, a stray mother cat, nursing her own litter, who took the wild cub as one of her own. What followed was a heartwarming tale of instinct, acceptance, and an extraordinary bond that defied nature's rules. Could a domestic cat truly raise a wild predator as her own? And what would happen when the time came for the bobcat to return to the wilderness? Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Sarah Miller had always considered herself more of a dog person. But life has a peculiar way of challenging our firmly held beliefs. As the lead veterinary technician at the Animal Rescue Foundation in rural Montana, Sarah had seen her fair share of unusual cases over the past decade. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for the events that unfolded during the spring of 2023, a season that would forever change her understanding of maternal love and the mysterious bonds that can form between the wild and domestic worlds. The day began like any other at the shelter. Sarah arrived just as dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Mountains, their snow-capped peaks catching the first rays of sunlight. The air still held that crisp mountain chill that made Montana springs so distinctive. As she unlocked the shelter's front door, her thoughts were occupied with the day's routine tasks, medications to administer, kennels to clean, and the newest arrival, a stray mother cat with 5 kittens rescued from an abandoned barn the previous evening. The mother cat, whom they'd named Sweet Pea for her gentle disposition, was already proving to be an exceptional parent. Despite her obvious exhaustion and malnourished state when they found her, she remained vigilant over her 5 tiny kittens, each no more than 2 weeks old. Sarah had settled them in the shelter's quiet room, a space reserved for nursing mothers and their babies, away from the general population's hustle and bustle. As Sarah went about her morning rounds, her phone buzzed with an urgent call from Linda Harrison, a regular shelter volunteer who lived on the outskirts of town, where the suburban sprawl gave way to wild Montana countryside. "Sarah, you need to come out here right away," Linda's voice was tense with concern. "I found something unusual in my backyard. It's a baby bobcat, couldn't be more than a few weeks old. I've been watching for hours, but there's no sign of the mother." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. In her years of animal rescue work, she'd encountered orphan wildlife before, but bobcats were special cases. They required specialized care and, eventually, rehabilitation for release back into the wild. "Have you seen any signs of injury?" Sarah asked, already grabbing her emergency kit. "No, but it's so young, its eyes aren't even open yet. I've kept my distance, but I can hear it crying, Sarah. It sounds so hungry." 20 minutes later, Sarah pulled up to Linda's modest ranch house, which backed up against a dense stretch of forest. Linda met her at the driveway, her silver hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, worry etched across her face. She led Sarah to the back of the property, where a small clearing met the treeline. There, beneath a scraggly juniper bush, lay a tiny form, no bigger than Sarah's palm. The baby bobcat's spotted fur was dusted with pine needles, its eyes still sealed shut, its mouth opening in periodic mewls of hunger and distress. Sarah's trained eye could see this was a newborn, probably no more than a week old. "I found him early this morning," Linda explained, wringing her hands. "I thought maybe the mother was just hunting, but it's been hours now. There are some new housing developments going up about a mile from here. I'm worried they might have scared her away, or worse." Sarah knew the developments Linda mentioned. The steady encroachment of human habitation into wildlife corridors had been causing increasing conflicts between the wild and domestic worlds. She knelt down to examine the tiny creature more closely, careful to minimize her contact. The bobcat kitten was male, and while he showed no signs of injury, his body temperature was lower than it should be, and his cries were growing weaker. "We need to make a decision," Sarah said quietly. "If we leave him here, hoping the mother returns, he likely won't survive the night. But if we take him, and she does come back..." Linda nodded grimly. I've been watching all day, no tracks, no signs. And there's a storm coming in. She gestured to the darkening clouds gathering over the mountains. With a heavy heart, Sarah gently wrapped the tiny bobcat in a soft towel from her kit. "We'll call him Bob," she said, managing a small smile. "Let's get him to the shelter. I've got an idea, but it's a bit unconventional." The drive back to the shelter was tense, with Bob's weakening cries serving as a countdown clock. Sarah knew that without immediate intervention, his chances of survival were slim. Bobcat kittens this young needed constant care, warmth, and, most importantly, mother's milk. Formula could work in a pinch, but it was far from ideal. As she drove, Sarah's mind kept returning to Sweet Pea and her kittens. Cross-fostering between domestic cats and wild felines was rare but not unheard of. She'd read about cases in wildlife rehabilitation journals, though she'd never attempted it herself. The risks were significant. Sweet Pea might reject Bob, or worse, harm him. But as she listened to the tiny bobcat's increasingly feeble cries, Sarah knew they had to try. Back at the shelter, Sarah's colleague Mike Torres was waiting, having received her urgent text about the situation. A veteran wildlife rehabilitator with 20 years of experience, Mike's expertise would be crucial in making this work. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, examining the tiny bobcat while Sarah prepared the introduction area. "Sweet Pea's already got 5 mouths to feed." "She's our best chance," Sarah replied, laying out clean blankets in a large enclosure. "She's healthy, despite her rough start, and her milk production is strong. Most importantly, her kittens are almost exactly the same age as Bob." The timing couldn't be better. They worked quickly but carefully, following protocols for wildlife handling while also trying to make the introduction as natural as possible. Sweet Pea watched them curiously from her nest box as they set up a larger enclosure that would give the expanded family more space. The moment of truth came when Sarah carefully placed Bob near Sweet Pea's other kittens. The tiny bobcat, warmed and slightly more energetic after receiving subcutaneous fluids, immediately began crawling toward the smell of milk and warmth. Sarah and Mike held their breath, ready to intervene if Sweet Pea showed any signs of aggression. What happened next would remain etched in Sarah's memory forever. Sweet Pea leaned forward, her pink nose twitching as she sniffed the newcomer thoroughly. Bob, guided by instinct, continued his determined crawl toward her belly. Then, to everyone's amazement, Sweet Pea began to purr. She gently nuzzled the tiny bobcat, guiding him to nurse alongside her other kittens. "Would you look at that?" Mike whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Guess love really is blind." Over the next few weeks, the unlikely family thrived under the shelter's careful supervision. Bob, though slightly larger than his adopted siblings, integrated seamlessly into the litter. Sweet Pea showed no favoritism, caring for all 6 babies with equal devotion. She groomed Bob just as she did her own kittens, tolerated his slightly sharper claws with patience, and even seemed to adjust her nursing position to accommodate his more vigorous feeding style. The shelter staff documented everything meticulously, knowing that this unusual case could provide valuable insights for future wildlife rehabilitation efforts. They noted how Bob's development, while following a similar pattern to his domestic siblings, showed subtle differences. His spots became more pronounced, his ear tufts more prominent, and his build more muscular. Word of the unusual family spread through the local community, and soon the shelter was fielding calls from news outlets and wildlife organizations across the country. Sarah worked hard to maintain the delicate balance between public interest and the family's need for peace and privacy. She knew that while their story was touching, the ultimate goal was to prepare Bob for eventual return to the wild. As the weeks passed, the differences between Bob and his adopted siblings became more pronounced. While the domestic kittens were content to play with toy mice and balls of yarn, Bob showed an early interest in more active pursuits. He practiced pouncing with intense focus, his natural hunting instincts emerging despite his domestic surroundings. Sweet Pea watched these developments with what Sarah swore was maternal pride, occasionally joining in his play sessions with an energy that belied her usual gentle demeanor. The most challenging phase began when it was time to start weaning the kittens. The domestic kittens took to solid food readily, but Bob was more resistant to the change. Sweet Pea, showing remarkable adaptability, continued to nurse him longer than the others, seeming to understand his different needs. Sarah worried about this extended dependency, but Mike assured her it was normal for bobcat kittens to nurse longer than domestic cats. Nature has its own timeline, he reminded her. We have to trust the process. As Bob grew stronger and more independent, the shelter staff began making preparations for the next phase of his journey. They converted one of the shelter's outdoor enclosures into a specialized space where Bob could begin learning the skills he'd need for life in the wild. The enclosure featured natural vegetation, climbing structures, and even a small pool, as bobcats are surprisingly comfortable around water. The transition was gradual. At first, Bob spent just an hour or two each day in the outdoor enclosure, always returning to Sweet Pea and his siblings for comfort and companionship. Sarah noticed how Sweet Pea would wait by the indoor enclosure door until Bob returned, greeting him with gentle headbutts and purrs, just as she did with her other kittens. But as summer progressed, Bob spent more time in the outdoor enclosure, his natural instincts growing stronger. He became more interested in the birds that landed near his enclosure and the small rodents that occasionally ventured close. The shelter staff began introducing supervised hunting exercises, using specially designed toys to help him develop the skills he'd need for survival. The most poignant moments came during the evening hours, when Sarah would sometimes stay late to observe the family. Sweet Pea would sit near the partition between the enclosures, watching Bob as he practiced his hunting skills. Though they could no longer share the same space due to Bob's growing size and strength, their bond remained evident in the way they would chirp and call to each other. As autumn approached, Bob had grown into a handsome young bobcat, his spotted coat thick and healthy, his movements confident and precise. The time was approaching for the final phase of his rehabilitation, release back into the wild. The shelter team had selected a protected area deep in the national forest, far from human development but with plenty of natural prey and water sources. The day before Bob's scheduled release, Sarah spent extra time with the unusual family. Sweet Pea seemed to sense the coming change, staying closer to Bob's enclosure than usual. Her other kittens, now adopted into loving homes, except for one that Sweet Pea would keep as a companion, had all found their own paths. But the bond between the mother cat and her wild adopted son remained special. The release day dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a new beginning. The transport carrier containing Bob was loaded into the shelter's van, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how Sweet Pea watched from her window, her eyes following their movements. As they drove into the mountains, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey they'd all shared. The release site was a peaceful clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a small stream running nearby, ideal bobcat habitat. When they opened the carrier, Bob emerged cautiously, his powerful muscles tense with anticipation. He took a few steps forward, then turned to look back at Sarah and Mike, as if saying goodbye. "Go on," Sarah whispered, her voice catching. "Your mother raised you well." With one final look, Bob bounded into the underbrush, his spotted coat blending perfectly with the dappled forest shadows. Sarah and Mike waited until sunset, following protocol to ensure he didn't return to the release site. As they drove back to the shelter, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: joy at Bob's successful rehabilitation, sadness at the farewell, and deep gratitude for the remarkable cat who had made it all possible. Back at the shelter, Sweet Pea greeted them with her usual gentle purrs, though Sarah noticed she spent some time that evening looking out the window toward the mountains. In the following days, the mother cat seemed more subdued, but her nurturing nature remained unchanged. Within a week, she was helping care for a litter of orphan kittens brought to the shelter, showing the same devotion she had shown to Bob. The story of Sweet Pea and Bob had a lasting impact on the shelter and the community. It inspired several local initiatives to protect wildlife corridors and promote coexistence between wild and domestic animals. The shelter established a new wildlife rehabilitation program, with Sweet Pea as its unofficial mascot. She would go on to help socialize other orphan kittens, though Bob remained her most remarkable achievement. Over the next few years, wildlife cameras in the release area occasionally captured images of a healthy male bobcat, distinguished by a unique pattern of spots that the shelter staff recognized immediately. While they could never be entirely certain it was Bob, Sarah liked to think it was him, thriving in the wild, thanks to the love and care of an extraordinary mother cat. The legacy of Sweet Pea and Bob's story extended far beyond their immediate circle. It became a powerful reminder of nature's capacity for unexpected connections and the boundless dimensions of maternal love. In a world often divided between wild and domestic, their story proved that sometimes the most meaningful bonds transcend such artificial boundaries. Sarah kept a photo of Sweet Pea and Bob together on her desk at the shelter, a reminder of that remarkable spring when a stray mother cat taught them all about the true meaning of family. It served as a daily inspiration in her work, a testament to the extraordinary things that can happen when compassion knows no bounds. Sweet Pea lived out her days at the shelter, becoming something of a local celebrity. Visitors would often ask to meet the cat who had raised a bobcat, and she would greet them with the same gentle dignity she had shown throughout her remarkable journey. Her story was shared in schools and nature centers, teaching young people about the importance of wildlife conservation and the unexpected ways that love can bridge the gap between different species. As for Sarah, the experience changed her perspective on animal rehabilitation forever. She had always known that animals were capable of deep emotional connections, but Sweet Pea and Bob's story demonstrated just how profound those bonds could be. It reminded her that in nature, as in life, the most beautiful moments often come from the most unexpected situations. Years later, whenever Sarah would look up at the mountains surrounding the shelter, she thought of Bob, the tiny orphan bobcat who found an unlikely mother in a gentle stray cat, and she thought of Sweet Pea, the former street cat who proved that a mother's heart knows no bounds. Their story remained a testament to the extraordinary capacity for love and adaptation in the animal kingdom, and a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful connections are the ones that defy our expectations. The end of their immediate story together marked not an ending, but a beginning of new understanding about the connections possible between wild and domestic animals, a beginning of more comprehensive wildlife rehabilitation programs, and, most importantly, a beginning of new hope for other orphan animals who might need the same kind of unconditional love that Sweet Pea had shown to Bob. In the end, it wasn't just about a cat raising a bobcat. It was about the universal nature of maternal love, the resilience of the animal spirit, and the remarkable things that can happen when we open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. Sweet Pea and Bob's story continues to inspire those who hear it, reminding us that in nature, as in life, love knows no boundaries.